So today we are still in the book of Isaiah, and then it looks like next week we are going to move into John. So we're going to get to move into the New Testament. Sometimes that's a little easier, maybe not, but sometimes it is. So today we're studying from Isaiah 51, 1 through 8, for anyone that would like to read in your Bible as we go along. For those of you that might be watching on Facebook, we're excited to have you and hope you enjoy it, and come out and join us at church if you can. And we're happy, if you're traveling, maybe you could have a chance to listen to it. I've done that a couple of times, and I've enjoyed being able to still hear the service when I'm away. So it's a good option, I think. It's never quite the same as not being here, but it is good to still be able to keep in touch and hear the words that are said. I didn't mention Rodney and Cassandra, but remember them, they are traveling. They're out west. Yesterday they were in South Dakota, and the plan is to go on to Montana and then I think into Canada too. So they're going to be gone probably still another couple of weeks. So just keep them in your prayers too as they're traveling with their camper. So the first verse, well, actually I'll go into the introduction first. And the title is Look Both Ways. And we remember as children, we were always taught, before you cross the street, look both ways, right? That was a big thing, And now it's talking about in this introduction how many distractions we have. So now it's just not looking for the car, maybe coming from the left or right. We might be trying to kind of text as we're walking, or we're maybe listening to some music or a podcast or something, and there's just so many distractions. And even, we're all taught, don't text and drive. But, we see people doing it, so they're distracted. So we kind of have to watch for what's going on around us all the time. And it can make it difficult. So it's not just walking and looking or driving or whatever and looking both ways. The commentary brings up that it's important that we look up. So we look to God too. Maybe before we look left and right, we'll look up and make sure that God's taking care of us. And in the lesson today, it's going to be talking about how the people were told to look to God. In so many ways. They were taught to look to their past because that's where they would gain a lot of their information, and they gain knowledge from what had happened to their forefathers. Look to the present time, be focused on God, not idols, not things like that, but really focusing on God. And then they were also taught to look to the future, because things could improve in the future. A little bit of background. Some of you probably read The Tale of Two Cities in school. I can remember reading. I don't remember too much about it. But it was this kind of a story of the best of times and the worst of times. And the people of Judah were, they were experiencing some of the best of times. Their economic system was really good. Their military was really good. But the bad times were that they had turned to idolatry in a lot of ways, and that was not good. And, God is the only one true God, and God was not happy that they were seeking other gods. So this was a problem. Judah's punishment was an indictment of their false gods and of the sins those gods condoned. The people had turned from true God in spite of the great acts of deliverance they had experienced as a nation. And think back to the day, of Moses' time. They'd learned the 10 Commandments. And one of those commandments was, you will have no other gods before you. So they were breaking some of those commandments, and God was not happy about that. They had gone through this Babylonian time where they were held captive in Babylon. So after they were actually able to get away from this exile, they really didn't turn back to the idols again. In the commentary, it brings out that that really didn't seem to be a problem after that time, but it had been a big problem before. So, and then looking at the Babylonians, because they were so big on using the other gods and looking to those, then the times that they had turned to a bad time for them. So they had been very successful and prosperous, and they had taken over the people of Judah and were holding them in exile. And then because of this idol worship, they then had their own set of problems. So their good times went to bad times. Though the people bowed to gods that they made, the God of the heavens had declared their end. Their best of times was about to become a permanent close. And this was talking about the Babylonian people. So now we're going to start the verses. Verse 1a, listen to me, you who pursue righteousness and who seek the Lord. So Isaiah is speaking here, and it says our text contains 3 calls to listen. Each call is followed by a 2-part description of the people who are being addressed. So in this case, he's saying pursue righteousness and those who seek the Lord. Those who strive to be righteous want to live according to God's laws and his will. To seek is to have a goal and to search diligently to reach it. God is near those who look for him. We can note the many philosophers who have sought to define the good life without feeling the need to include God's will in the equation. And we can think of people who say they seek God but do not seem to be inclined to obey his laws, choosing instead a God of their own making. Any attempts that do not seek God and also strive to obey him will be lacking. These do not lead to true or eternal life. So kind of getting away from God is a bad idea. You know, we need God's influence at all times. We always need to be guided by what God is telling us. So we have a question, what circumstances distract or discourage you from seeking righteousness? I think there are many, many things in the world today that can distract us. And probably each person may have their own personal things that they deal with, but always trying to get our path narrow and always looking to God will help us stay on track. Verse 1b and 2, look to the rock from which you were cut, and to the quarry from which you were hewn. Look to Abraham, your father, and to Sarah, who gave you birth. When I called him, he was only one man, and I blessed him and made him many. So when we first read this, we might think that they're talking about the rock as being God. And you know that many times then in the New Testament, Jesus is referred to as the rock. But in this case, actually, Abraham is the rock. And then also, Sarah is the part that it says, is likened to the quarry from which you were born, you were hewn. It's a parallelism when you think about her womb. And Isaiah came from her womb. And the birth of Isaiah was the beginning of all the descendants of Abraham. Now we know there was Hagar, and she bore Abraham a son, but it was Sarah who bore the child that would be the child of all the nations. So that's kind of where we're being led today, is to think about Abraham as that rock, because he was kind of that first forefather, and all the nations came from Abraham. And if you think back, you know, he thought that he and Sarah weren't going to have any kids. And but even in Sarah's old age, God would bless them with a child. And I mean, it was just all part of his plan. So remember the joy of salvation when you became a Christian. Look back to the beginning of your walk with Christ for a refresher. There's a little story here about is called the Rock. Petra in western Jordan is the red rock city carved out of living stone. It is believed by many to be Selah, possibly also referenced in Judges and Isaiah. Especially interesting to me when I visited was the eastern entrance. A narrow half-mile pathway down a wadi took us through a crevice in a wall of rock. At the end of the wadi, an unforgettable view of this solid rock city presented itself to us. Tradition says that wall is the stone that Moses struck to get water for the people of Israel, and the cleft in the rock is the fissure through which water poured out. Remembering one's solid foundation sets the tone for growth throughout life. Abraham served as the solid foundation and example of faithful, righteous living for Israel. Today we look to the one Abraham waited for, and that, of course, is Jesus Christ. How will you honor your solid foundation? And as I was reading this, I thought about this rock and this tiny little crevice to get there. You know, I think that would be scary, kind of going through there to actually be able to view this. But it sounds like it was quite miraculous then to actually view how this was all formed. And the connection with Moses actually striking this area. So I thought that was kind of neat. In verse 3, the Lord will surely comfort Zion and will look with compassion on all her ruins. He will make her deserts like Eden, her wastelands like the garden of the Lord. Joy and gladness will be found in her, thanksgiving and the sound of singing. So the destruction of Zion was complete and completely devastating, so much so that Judah broadly and Jerusalem specifically were ruins. And I had to think about the Ukraine during this. You know, you see the pictures of the devastation there. And I imagine it was probably something similar. And I mean, how do you go back in there and start all over? You know, I mean, it takes a long time. And I think that's when I've studied this and when I've taught before and when I've listened to others teach, I've always been amazed at how these areas could be just really destroyed, but then they would rebuild. And of course, with God's help, they were prosperous. But it was a difficult time, I'm sure, just beginning to think that how will we start all over? It says it wasn't simply left empty, but intact. When the people went into exile, the city was left in chaos, stones overthrown, buildings burned to the ground, and likely even unburied human remains in the streets. So this was a terrible time. So only by imagining how complete and brutal the Babylonians' conquest of Jerusalem was, can we imagine how good this news is. Deserts, where a city once was a lonesome, haunting image, but a thriving Eden, a paradise in its place, is a hopeful, joyful image. So we have to think way, way back to the very beginning, before Adam and Eve sinned. They were in the Garden of Eden. And, you know, they were growing things. They weren't worried about weeds. They weren't worried about anything to do with, I'm sure they did not have bugs. They did not have fire ants. They were not plagued by so many things even that we deal with today. So today in my yard, I have these things that have like little thorns on them. And they love to grow up in my bushes. And you can't just pull them out, you know, and if you just cut it off, it doesn't do any good because it just comes right back. So it seems like, you know, we're always plagued with these things that we don't want, but yet we have to deal with them. And I think that reminds us of the sin that was committed and the things in this world. There's so much sin around us. We're always faced with situations. And if we think back to how it was for them, that's how heaven would be. You know, it's going to be this beautiful place where we're not burdened with sins and sickness and weeds and all these things that really get to us. It said, nothing could be better for Jerusalem than for her wastelands to become like the garden of the Lord. Add to that people who had experienced life outside of such a paradise, the thanksgiving and sound of singing of returned exiles to such a place would surely be a symphony of joy and gladness. So, and it talks about joy. You know, that is a characteristic of Christians. We have the joy of knowing Jesus and having Jesus in our lives. Philippians 4:4 gives a double command to rejoice. And 1 Thessalonians 5:16, the admonition is to rejoice always. And, you know, there was that song that we used to sing here, rejoice in the Lord always, and again I say rejoice. And I always loved a lot of those little songs that we sang because they really were based on Scripture. So, you know, if you're remembering the song and you're singing along, then you're remembering those Scriptures. When our life or our world seems like devastated Zion, our joy comes from the knowledge that God has a greater plan. The destruction is not the end, and knowing that, we can experience joy no matter how temporary the situation. So, you know, sometimes, you know, I think sometimes with us, we don't know how long the situation's going to last. You know, we're in a situation and we want it to end, but sometimes we kind of have to go through that knowing that we are going to have a better day. Things are going to improve. We will experience joy again, but we have to look to Jesus for that. This is a little story. It's called A Thriving City. Are urban dwellers entitled to green space in their cities? The Parks for All nonprofit is dedicated to the creation, maintenance, and beautification of public parks, playgrounds, and green space throughout New Orleans. The organization holds that well-planned and maintained parks are key to thriving in a city. More city planners and other officials agree, and a growing body of research asserts that green space are good for health, mental, and physical, and overall well-being of a city's population. God is well ahead of this urban trend, describing the newly rebuilt Jerusalem as an Eden. Even the New Jerusalem centers on a life-giving tree and river. And that's, you know, we read about that in Revelations. The reconstructed Jerusalem would not be a perfect city on earth, but in both human thriving and natural beauty, it would be a beautiful place and a sign of what God has in store for his faithful people. Challenge yourself this week to go to one of your local parks and consider the many varied ways that God provides for you and your community. And I had to think of back when the girls and I went to New York several years ago now. So, you know, you have the hustle and bustle of the city. And then when we went into the park, it was just the most tranquil place. You know, it's very peaceful. That green space they're talking about, you know, that, and I couldn't believe like we were in the same city. Because, you know, we were in the park and there was people playing and, you know, playing ball and kids running around and I couldn't believe how big the area was. You know, I used to, before I went there, in my mind, I thought of just like a very small little park. The park was huge. And you could walk a long way through the park where people were running and you could just see just the joy and the excitement of being in that part of the city. Even though we were in the city, it was much different than the other side where there was that hustle and bustle and getting on and off subways and all the people and all the huge buildings and the places, you know, to shop and everything. And then you had this very quiet, tranquil area. And that just really, that came to mind as I was reading this. And I'm sure those people really look forward to that day when, they can just step out into the park and kind of relax. Verse 4a, listen to me, my people, hear me, my nation. So when you hear the word listen, that means pay attention. So pay attention. Isaiah was saying, listen to what I'm saying. Pay attention to me. And he's still kind of talking to those Jews that had gone through that exile in Babylon. It's clear that this call is to the descendants of Abraham. Isaiah does not need to be so explicit here because of the specifics before. 4b, instructions will go out from me. My justice will become a light to the nations. So this is this verse kind of parallels to a prophecy made in Isaiah 2:3 that God's instruction would go forth from Zion. The servant was previously identified as the one to bring forth justice. Here again, this was, something that was saying, don't hide from the light of the Lord. Look to the Lord and draw yourself to the Lord. Verse 5, my righteousness draws near speedily. My salvation is on the way, and my arm will bring justice to the nations. The islands will look to me and wait in hope for my arm. So I thought about the word arm, I like to swim, but I'm always thinking about, I'm always kind of looking around, making sure everybody's doing okay. Of course, I'm hoping I'm doing okay too. But you always think about that arm reaching out to save somebody. It's so important to have that arm there just in case, especially if you're swimming maybe in the ocean where you don't know the depth of the water. There's holes, there's sharks, there's, things that could be dangerous to you. But so I thought of that arm as being that person or that thing that's going to grab you in case you start to sink. Well, in this case, that arm is the arm of God, and he's going to help these people. It kind of goes back to that whole righteousness thing and the thoughts of salvation and how Jesus is our saving grace. Jesus died for us. He gives us that salvation that we need. And it talks about Jesus, how for a lot of times Jesus was misunderstood in the beginning. The people thought that, he was maybe like some of the other rebellious messiahs, but he wasn't. He was coming under a spiritual nature, and he was coming to save everyone. And it actually links the word islands to the people from all nations. So, Jesus didn't just come to save the Jews. He came to save the Gentiles. He came to save us all. And that's why Jesus was so important. His death was so important for all of us. So he's that strong arm that reached out. All we have to do is say, yes, I accept you. I accept your arm. Just take care of me. It's so important that we think of it that way. So the Lord directs the people to maintain justice and do what is right. For my salvation is close at hand, and my righteousness will soon be revealed. So he welcomes everybody. He welcomes strangers. He welcomed the eunuchs. And they were people that were kind of excluded from Israel, you might say. But he included everyone. That's why we're all included. The arm of the Lord is often associated with deliverance and justice. Here his judgment is linked to the people's hope. Without the Lord's promise to judge, it would be impossible to trust him. After all, how could a good God who loves righteousness simply ignore evil? And if he did not have the power to judge, that would be another reason for mistrust. But this God has the authority, the will, the power to judge the wicked and will protect all who place their trust in him. So, I'm so thankful, that we have God. 6a, lift up your eyes to the heavens. Look at the earth beneath. The heavens will vanish like smoke. The earth will wear out like a garment, and its inhabitants die like flies. So this is a pretty strong verse, and I think we just kind of always think, well, heaven's always going to be there. The earth is always going to be there, but God is in control of everything, and it's God's decisions, and it's how God plans things that it's God's timing, basically. That's the best way to put it. So it talks about the smoke drifts on the wind and then dissipates. So you know how you can see a big smoke and then it just kind of moves away and it clears. And then it also talks about our garments. Think about that favorite shirt that you wear it all the time and you do yard work in it, and then it starts to get some holes and it just wears out because you wear it a lot and you like it. So it's talking about that type of thing where the earth is going to wear out like that garment. And it says all creation only lasts as long as God chooses to sustain it. We all know that our days are numbered on this earth. Life is also described as fleeting, like the speed with which smoke disappears or an old garment falls to shreds, so will its inhabitants die. And of course, that's talking about all living creatures. We all know that we're all going to die eventually. Thankfully, we have heaven, and we can think about, so many people at the end of their life, they get to the point they talk about how excited they are to see heaven, because they've maybe been through a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, and they don't really mind leaving this earth. It may be more difficult for someone that looks at their life and thinks they still have a lot more life to live. But in many cases, that person may be looking forward to actually moving on to heaven. Verse 6b, but my salvation will last forever. My righteousness will never fail. So here, he's talking about the purpose of the coming of the Messiah was to grant these things to the ones who come to Jesus through faith. And though sin has an end, righteousness will be the law of the heavenly land where the saints will live with God. So it also talks about we have choices. We have the wide gate or the broad gate, and then we have that narrow gate. And we always have to keep our focus on Jesus, which is that narrow gate, that narrow road. It's very easy to get sidetracked. It's very easy, as we were talking about, those influences in our lives that can pull us one way or the other. But we have to stay strong in what we know in Jesus, and we know that Jesus is always with us. And it requires us to be very dedicated. Because we have so many influences that can just pull us away. We always have to try to walk in God's way, but of course we know it's worth it. It's always worth it when we stick with God. Verse 7a, hear me, you who know what is right, you people who have taken my instruction to heart. So here again, we're hearing that word hear, listen. We know all about that. As before, you who know what is right are the very same people who have taken God's instructions to heart. And those who took their studies while seriously spoke the joy towards God. So there is that joy in knowing that we're a child of God. Verse 7b and 8a. Do not fear the reproach of mere mortals, or be terrified by their insults, for the moth will eat them up like a garment, and the worm will devour them like the wool. So the commentary brings out that, it's not like something huge is going to take care of these people. It may be a tiny moth. you know how small a moth is, but we know how that moth can tear up a wool sweater, you know, or that worm, how it can just, you know, cut through a plant that you're trying to grow. So we know in many times it's not going to be that bear maybe, or that fire, a massive fire. It's not going to be something like that that would take care of these people. It might be something minute. I thought about a virus. What have we just dealt with? COVID, you know, a tiny virus has killed millions of people. So I thought this is very, even though this was written way back thousands of years ago, still very pertinent to us today. Verse 8b, this is the last verse, I promise. But my righteousness will last forever, my salvation through all generations. And I'm so thankful we do end up here on a very positive note. Again, we're kind of drawn to that salvation that gives us, and that salvation lasts forever. God is so faithful to us from generation to generation. He is so faithful. He forgives. And this salvation is that last plan. There is no next salvation to come. Each generation is given the opportunity to accept the gift. And that is the gift of Jesus Christ. I'll just close with prayer. Dear Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for these words. Please help us stay on the narrow path. Please help us always trust in you and look to you to help us solve every problem that we're faced with. In your name I pray. Amen.